Hi everyone. You should now all have watched the previous video on the introduction lesson to representations, and today we are going to be looking at representations more specifically to do with the Dark Knight. I'm going to start off by explaining a couple of terms and talking about, just giving you some reminders, sorry, about representation in general, before moving on to more specific elements of the film. So, representation in media. What is representation in media? I spoke about this in the previous video, but let's just do a little bit of a recap. If you've not already made these notes that are coming up, if you've not already written these down in your folders and your notepads, please do that before moving on, because you will need notes on what representation actually is. So, representation is all about the way the elements of media are represented. So, it's really important to remember that anything that you see in the media, whether that's a film or a documentary or a newspaper or an advert or a billboard, anything at all, they are simply versions of reality. The reason that they are versions of reality is because one person, a producer or a director or whoever it is, has constructed the media text to convey a message that they want to give to us, the audience. So, whatever their message is, they're having to carefully construct representations in order to get that message across. So, that's why when you're watching a film or a documentary or an advert or anything, and you see a particular type of person or a culture or a religion or anything like that being represented, that doesn't mean that that representation is true. Representations tend to rely a lot on stereotypes and appeal to our cultural assumptions. So we make cultural assumptions based on what we assume to be true within our culture and within our society. We tend to share ideas and opinions and beliefs within our own cultures with other people that subscribe to that culture, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail just now. So, like I say, if you've not got these notes written down, please pause the video here and write these down. So, what are cultural assumptions? So, I would like you just to make sure that you copy down these points as well, because I'm going to just show you a few different notes on cultural assumptions while I explain to you what they mean. So, there are three major elements that make up a culture. So, we all belong to a particular culture. Some people might belong to more than one culture. It's important to recognise that although the culture that we live in within Scotland, within Whitburn even, you tend to have shared beliefs and ways of behaving with other people that subscribe to that culture. So cultures set out an expectation of how people should behave in that society. So the three major elements that make up a culture are these: shared values. So when you are part of a culture, you tend to have the same sorts of values as other people that belong to that culture as well. You also have, like I said, a shared understanding of expectations of behaviour. So, for example, in the culture that we live in, we know that you shouldn't go about stealing, you shouldn't go about injuring people, you shouldn't go about bullying people, killing people is a no-no. So we have a sort of standard set for the way that we should be behaving. We tend to believe in our culture that everybody is equal in our society. Now, not all cultures believe that. Some cultures have a hierarchy where, say, the father is at the top and he deserves the most respect, and then below him is the mother, and then below that is the government or whoever it might be. But some cultures have a particular hierarchy where certain people within the culture and within the society deserve, according to that culture, more respect than other people towards the bottom. In our culture in Scotland, we tend not to put people on pedestals. We tend not to have a hierarchy of respect. We tend to talk about affording the same amount of respect to everybody. You're supposed to respect everybody equally. And the third one is a shared understanding of symbols. So we tend to have symbols in our culture where the minute that you see them, you just know what they mean without any further explanation. So if I just show you a couple of what I mean when I talk about symbols, you've got religious symbols here that have just popped up. Now I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, know what those symbols are sort of describing, what they symbolise. You also have national symbols as well. I'm sure you all know what the thistle symbolises. You have symbols of products too. I'm sure without me even telling you what this product is, you will already know. You have symbols in our culture and the society that keep us safe. You have symbols of recreation and leisure. I would be surprised if anybody didn't know what this symbol was for. And you have symbols that direct us to places that are commonly used within our culture, like this one here. So I'm sure that all of you will recognise most, if not all, of these symbols that are used in our culture. And media creators of media, like directors and producers, they tend to use symbols like this in order to represent particular people and places and cultures and things like that, because the makers of media, they know that we will recognise symbols like this automatically. So I'm going to move on to just reminding you about a couple of things to do with analysing representations. So remember, when we're analysing representations, we have to focus on three things, and the first thing that we need to focus on is the selection. So that is what is being represented. So who or what is being represented as what. We also need to think about the portrayal, so that's how is the representation being constructed. And we need to focus on the cultural assumptions. So this is the effect that the selection and portrayal have. The why has the filmmaker constructed this representation in this way. Now, if you didn't write down the notes for these three parts of representation, can you please pause the video here and make sure that you have a note of these three, because this is going to help you with a couple of the tasks that are coming up later on. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about stereotypes. I talked about this in the previous video, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Just as a reminder, what stereotypes are. So stereotypes are the assumption that all members of a group, whether that be a grouping to do with race or gender or culture or whatever it is, it's the assumption that all members behave in the same way. Okay, we tend not to like stereotypes in our society and our culture. We tend to sort of want to rail against stereotyping. However, in media makers, producers, directors, they tend to use stereotypes quite a lot. The reason for that is because although we don't tend to think that it's morally right to stereotype people, media makers have found that audiences feel more comfortable when they see a stereotype on screen, and the reason for that is because when you see a stereotype, you say it's a stereotype character, you automatically know what to expect from that character, so it makes audiences feel more comfortable. There's dangers in that as well, which we'll come to, but that's the reason why stereotypes tend to still be used in things like film and adverts and things. So what I would like you to do as just a quick 2-minute task is I'm going to show you an image in a second, and I want you to list the stereotypes that are present in this image. Okay, it's a cartoon that's going to pop up. So you've got 2 minutes for this, guys. So I would like you just to pause the video here, time yourself 2 minutes, and just make a bullet pointed list of all of the stereotypes that you can see about this particular person here. Okay, now that you've had a chance to do that task, I'd like to go over the answers. So I'm going to just come up with a few possible answers that you could have had, but remember that if something doesn't come up on the screen that you've had, it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It just means that I've missed it. So you'll know obviously that a cartoon character was a stereotypical American, and there were lots of different stereotypes of Americans within that cartoon. So you had things like, I'm just going to pop all of them up so that we can get the image up here and look at them both side by side. So one of the stereotypes is that Americans are patriotic, and we know this from the image because this particular person here has an big American flag. He's wearing an American flag cap. He has an eagle, the bald eagle that is representative of America on the front of his cap as well. That shows us that he's a patriot, and stereotypically Americans tend to want to be patriots. Another stereotype is that this American is overweight or obese. Another stereotype of Americans is that they eat too much, leading them to be overweight or obese. He's also been stereotyped to be unhealthy, and we can see that because he has an oxygen canister. He's obviously breathing in oxygen. Also, the other stereotype that's massive, there's been massive contention about it, is that all Americans like guns, because they protect their right to bear arms, which is in their constitution. So that's another stereotype for Americans. A couple that I wanted you to pick out, but which are less obvious, is that when we think about stereotypical Americans, we tend to stereotype Americans as being male and also being white. When we think about stereotypical American people, it's usually the male gender and white people that come to mind instead of any other race. Okay, so that was just a quick task just to get you thinking about stereotypes before we move on. So you can also have a particular person who has been represented in a couple of different ways, or maybe more than a couple of different ways, and we saw that in the previous video with Miley Cyrus, but I'm going to show you another example here. So here we have a representation of Amy Winehouse. So what do you think of this? We see her here. She is being represented as, she looks quite innocent there. She looks quite sweet, quite pleasant, very, very pretty, very, very tidy, lovely looking makeup. Her hair's lovely. She looks a wee bit edgy though because she's got a tattoo in her arm, but all in all she looks like a really very pleasant, well-rounded, well put together young woman. However, we have a different representation of Amy Winehouse here. So what do you think about this one? And how are the two representations different? These images represent Amy Winehouse in very, very different ways. So her official website used the first image that I showed you, and the Daily Mail used the image to the right. Why do you think that her official website has used one particular image, but the Daily Mail, which is a tabloid newspaper, used the image on the right to represent Amy Winehouse? What would be the reasons for that, do you think? Well, both of these pictures that we have just seen of Amy Winehouse, they adhere to our cultural assumptions. So things like drinking and smoking and nightclubbing are bad. They're seen to be bad, especially for women. There's lots of rhetoric around women putting themselves in danger when they're drinking too much or when they stay out too late. And for those of you that know about Amy Winehouse's history before she passed away, you'll know that was part of her frequent life, was going out and partying and drinking and taking drugs and smoking and things. But our cultural assumption that doing all those things is bad. So in our culture, the majority of people tend to believe that that's bad, and the media reinforces that that's bad. Her messy makeup, and the second one where we see all her mascara being smeared and running down her face, must mean that she's had a messy night, must mean that she's drunk too much or taken too much of something, and it's meant a messy night for her. Her girl next door image that you saw in the first picture of her, it means that she's very innocent, very cute, very nice, must be a really pleasant person. So those are the cultural assumptions that both of those pictures are giving to us. They're giving us messages about the type of person that Amy Winehouse is. So these are assumptions or ideologies held by society, and the media can either challenge or reinforce these ideologies. So do you remember Miley, who we looked at in the last lesson? What I would like you to do now is have a little think about this picture here. This is the same, it's a different picture, but it's from the same performance that she gave at the VMAs that I discussed in the previous video about representations. So in what way does this image of Miley Cyrus appeal to our cultural assumptions? What does this image, what messages does this image give to us? So take a few minutes, take 3 minutes, and have a think about this, and then write down some ideas about what messages this is giving to us, and how does this appeal to our cultural assumptions. Okay, now that you've had a chance to do that, let's talk about some of the answers. So again, you might have an answer that I don't have here. It just means that it doesn't necessarily mean that yours is wrong. It just means that I've not thought of it. So what you could do is you can maybe post some answers on the Teams page to this one if you've come up with something that doesn't pop up in the slide just now. So this was your question: in what way did this image of Miley Cyrus appeal to our cultural assumptions? So what messages is the media giving us by putting this image out into the world? Well, one of our cultural assumptions is that wearing revealing or skimpy clothing makes women seem promiscuous or provocative, and that overly confident women are unattractive. Both of these cultural assumptions are being appealed to by this particular picture, but during 2013, when this performance was first televised, and it was in the newspaper, it was in loads of different newspapers, people were actually being quoted, like famous people were actually being quoted as saying that Miley Cyrus looked unattractive because of, for example, her stance and her facial expressions and her body language that she was giving off and things like that. So there was a lot of sort of reinforcement behind the cultural assumptions as well, by people within our culture actually coming out and saying, yes, I think that she is unattractive because of this. I think that she is looking promiscuous because she's wearing this skimpy bikini. So now, guys, we're going to talk a little bit about dominant ideologies. So I would like you again to make sure you've got some paper and a pen in front of you, and make sure that you note down this definition of dominant ideologies. So what are dominant ideologies? Well, a dominant ideology is the attitude or beliefs, values, morals shared by the majority of the people in a given society. So just like what we've been discussing, guys, when you live within a society, you tend to follow the beliefs and the values and the morals that everybody else within that society does as well. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the dominant ideology of feminine beauty. So this is going to link to The Dark Knight and Rachel in particular. So the dominant ideology of feminine beauty is the attitude that we have towards feminine beauty within our society. But I'm going to start off with looking at some dominant ideologies of feminine beauty throughout history. So if we start with the 17th century, you can see here that there's been a painting. This painting's called Venus at a Mirror, and this was painted by Peter Paul Rubens in the 17th century. This is when sort of bigger, more sort of plumper female bodies were being idealised at this time. But how did that change? Well, we see that changing when we come to the Victorian era. So in the Victorian era, women were really, really body conscious. They started to wear these corsets that you see here to reduce their waistline, and these like bustles in their skirts. You'll see that the sort of like big behind that's protruding out, that was a bustle, and that was to magnify their behinds. They all sort of wanted big bums in the Victorian era. So that was a dominant ideology at that time. So we went from plumper bodies, overall plumper bodies and plumper faces, being idealised and being beautiful, to in the Victorian era, no, we want tiny little waists but we want big bums. So the dominant ideology changed in society at that time. What about the 1920s? Well, in the 1920s, women changed they wanted to start hiding their curves. They started having really short, sort of bobbed hair instead of long hair, and they started wearing really bold, sort of heavier makeup. The feminine ideal was no longer to be frail and sickly. It was actually in the Victorian era, women actually quite liked to look quite sickly. They would always put on like really white makeup to make themselves look pale and things. But 1920s women didn't want that, so they started doing like sports and things like that. So although they were still like really quite slim, and skinny, they wanted to be a little bit more athletic, but they wanted to hide their curves, and you can see that here with the woman with her sort of like baggy dress that she's got on. Fast forward to the 1950s, and you can see here, this is Marilyn Monroe. She was perceived as the absolute epitome of beauty at this time, and her image is even used today to sort of represent that really like sought after hourglass figure that was supposed to be the thing that the body type that all women should aspire to in the 1950s. We've kind of went back to that these days, but I'm going to come on to that in a little bit. So in the 1950s, the dominant ideology was getting away from being sort of skinny, and now women were expected to the dominant ideology of feminine beauty was to have this hourglass, curvaceous figure that you can see with Marilyn Monroe. Moving on to the 1960s then. We went away from the hourglass, curvaceous figure in the 1950s that you could see in Marilyn Monroe, back to skinny. Dominant ideology of feminine beauty went back to skinny in the 1970s. You can see here, this is Cher and Farrah Fawcett, looking very, very slim. And this at this time as well in the 1970s, this is when tanned skin also became popular. So women wanted to look browner than they had in previous decades and centuries. Next decade is the 1980s. So the beauty ideal was still to be thin at this time, but women wanted to be more toned, or they were told in the media that that was the ideal. The feminine ideal was to be more toned, but not too muscular. So that was why aerobics, like you can see here, that started becoming popular, and over the top fashion, like patterns and bright colours, became really popular as well. So the dominant ideology at the time of the 1980s was still be quite skinny, be a little bit toned, but you don't want to be overly muscular. And that was the ideal, the feminine beauty ideal of the 1980s. 1990s, we went back the way again. So you'll see here Kate Moss looking extremely skinny here. She was a huge figure in the 1990s. This image and other images of Kate Moss looking really skinny in this way, it actually coined the term heroin chic. So it was sort of popularly believed that that Kate Moss sort of took a lot of drugs and things like that, and that's what gave her this really skinny, gaunt looking frame. But that frame that she had became really popular. A lot of women wanted to aspire to have this body type, and I'm sure you can imagine all of the different problems that cropped up because of that. Moving on to the 2000s, body types changed again. So you can see here that tan skin was really popular in the 2000s. People were fake tanning left, right and centre. Big hair became really popular as well. Darker hair was really popular. People want the dominant ideology of feminine beauty at this time as well was to have a small waist, but to still maintain some level of curves, and people like Beyonce and Jennifer Lopez were celebrated in the early 2000s because they had tiny little waists, but they had like big behinds, and that was seen to be the feminine ideal in this decade. And lastly, we get on to the decade that we've just come out of now, so the 2010s. And we can see here that it's not so different to the the early 2000s, we are the dominant ideology, of feminine beauty, still idealizes small, cinched in, tiny little waists, big curvaceous behinds, big boobs as well, and that sort of curvaceous figure. But in the 2010s, we also saw a change from the big hair to more sleek, shiny hair, and we also saw a change in the dominant ideology of how makeup should look as well. Women started contouring their makeup at that time, which gave them a more theatrical look. It was no longer ideal for women to have, you'll see if I go back here, if you look at their eyebrows here, you'll see that they're very, very thin. It was no longer ideal in the 2010s to have little thin eyebrows, but larger, bushier eyebrows, thicker eyebrows were the new ideal that women should have. So all of that heavier makeup, the hourglass figure, that has been our ideal in the last decade. So I would like you to take out some paper again, make sure that you have a pen. I would like you to make a note on what's going to come up on feminine beauty on the screen just now. So the idea of beauty and the so-called ideal female shape in Western magazines, it bears little to no relation to the measurements of the majority of Western women. So when we see images of people like Kim Kardashian with her tiny little waist and her big behind, very, very, very few women actually have that body shape. But it's accepted as natural that models in women's magazines should be young and underweight as well, because that's what we're used to seeing in magazines. People being very, very skinny, flat stomachs, little tiny waists. We don't tend to see women who are of a bigger size or overweight women or anything like that in magazines. But since the 1960s, the preferred reading has been that these women are beautiful. However, there are signs that as the dominant ideology begins to adapt to the concerns of many that this body shape is actually unhealthy, the preferred reading is beginning to shift. So you see that throughout the decades. You see, right, skinny body is the ideal, and then the next decade it's like, no, actually we're going to try and women are aiming to have more sort of curvaceous figures. Then the next decade it goes back to skinny, then it goes to curvaceous again. So you see that the preferred readings shift decade on decade. Over recent years, size 0 models have been banned from the catwalk and fashion weeks the world over. Beauty magazine editors have responded to reader concerns that the models depicted on their pages are unrealistically thin. So again, body types that most women in the real sort of world away from the catwalk, they don't have these bodies, so why are they showing them on the catwalk with like modelling clothes that they want real women to buy? So it was reader concerns that models depicted on their pages are unrealistically thin, and they pledged to use so-called real women instead. So Dove, which is a cosmetics company, has made a global campaign for what they call real beauty, and this was the cornerstone of its marketing at the time that it launched this a few years ago. The outcry over the use of Photoshop to create unrealistically young and slim looking images in advertising continues to gather support. So there are other brands apart from Dove that are using so-called real women and real women's bodies in their advertising campaigns now. And there are signs that the dominant ideology is changing because of that. So the dominant ideology now, because we're seeing more sort of realistic looking bodies that you see on the street every day, instead of these very, very skinny models or your Kim Kardashians with a tiny waist and the big behind, because we are seeing women that look more like the women that you see in the street or at the shops or whatever, then that means that the dominant ideology is changing. So how do the female characters in The Dark Knight support or challenge the dominant ideology of feminine beauty? Have a little think about that question. What do you think about the characters in the the Dark Knight that you can see, are they adhering to this sort of unrealistic standard of feminine beauty, or does the Dark Knight challenge um, the the feminine the dominant ideology of feminine beauty? Do they challenge it, or um, do they sort of support it? What I would like you to do is just pause the video here and make sure that you have these notes down, guys, because this is going to help you when it comes to analysing the character of Rachel in a little bit. Now here we have some models, actresses, where you can see that that feminine ideal of their body shape being shown here. So that very, very skinny, very, very slim body type that although like that, I'm not taking away from these women, they look absolutely fantastic, but this is not a body type that you tend to see in everyday life. These are models and actresses that live in a very different society than what I'm going to say regular women do. So here's the Dove Real Beauty campaign here. So you can see a total difference between these three women here and the women in this advert. You can see a range of different body shapes, different races as well. So again, with these women here, you can see that apart from their body shape and body types, they all sort of look the same as well. They're all white, they all have long hair. But here we can see a range of different races and skin colours, skin tones, different hair colours, different hairstyles, lengths, different body shapes, different body styles. And according to Dove, this is what is more representative of women in the real world. Another campaign that you've probably seen more recently is by Snag Tights. So it's a company that makes tights for women, and well, it's a company that makes tights for women and men, but it's mainly the target audience is mainly women, but their slogan is "We've got your size," and they don't use models in their campaigns and their advertising. They use women who have actually bought their tights online, so they might contact women who are regular buyers of the product and ask them to model the tights for them. So each of the women that you can see in this shot here, none of them are models. They are all they're all just buyers of the tights. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about feminine roles. So if we're getting away from the dominant ideology of beauty standards, women also have particular roles that have been expected of them in the past. So going in hand with the dominant ideology of feminine beauty is the idea that women had set roles in society, and that is to assist and support the men. So again, I would like you to make sure that you're taking notes from this slide as we go through. So for years it was accepted that women didn't work, they did not get fully educated, and they lived solely to pass from being the property of their fathers, to being the property of their husbands. So this is where they would slot into a role commonly referred to as the 1950s housewife. They cooked, they cleaned, they tended to the children, they pandered to their husbands, kept a clean house, and they had to be nice and pleasant in company and in private. However, as women's rights expanded, the dominant ideology shifted, and women are now expected to pursue their own careers, be more independent of men, and become more powerful. Arguably, the media represents this idea in modern texts, although many still feel that the weight of the old ideology bearing down on them, arguing that women will never enjoy real equality in society or indeed in the media. So it's still a common argument from feminist groups, women in general really, that the way that they live their lives by being powerful in their careers, by being independent in their lives, isn't being accurately represented in the media, and that the media still subscribes to this dominant ideology of women being slightly lower than men, and still needing to lean on men, and still needing to be saved by men, and they're not quite as successful as their male counterparts either. So, how do you think that female characters in The Dark Knight support or challenge this dominant ideology? Have a think about that. Pause this video here and make sure that you've written down these notes here about feminine roles. So here we can see a couple of images that's got your typical, stereotypical 1950s housewife, very smiley, very well put together, nice little dresses that they're wearing, both of them in the kitchen. One of them looks like they're cleaning, the other one looks like she's away to get started on the dinner. She's admiring that frying pan very closely while her husband is out washing the car. Very nice makeup, very nice hair, and that was the dominant ideology that of what women should be like. That was their role, to be a pleasant, nice, happy woman in the house who did the cleaning and the cooking. But nowadays, we expect women, the dominant ideology has shifted so that our expectations of women are different. They can be successful and powerful in business. They can be well educated as well. Women can go to university, get degrees and doctorates and master's degrees now. And here you've got Hillary Clinton, who ran for president a few years ago. And we've just been you'll know that in the last few days, they've just appointed the first ever female vice president. So the dominant ideology about women's role in society has changed drastically from this to the power and education that women can now have. But does that power and education that women now have and can now gain, is that being accurately depicted or portrayed or represented in media today? Okay, so a little bit about stereotypes. So we've already talked about stereotypes assuming that all members of a certain race, gender or culture behave in the same way. And I spoke earlier about media using stereotypes to allow us to shortcut to a meaning, so people know what to expect from a stereotypical character, for example. So for example, if we saw any of the previous stereotypical representations, we would understand straight away what kind of characters these women were going to be. Stereotypes relate to cultural assumptions. So for example, the 1950s housewife relates to the assumption that all women should stay at home, cook and clean and look after the kids and look after their husbands and things. Stereotypes can be either totally made up, or some stereotypes involve some truths about these sections of society. So you have to be very, very careful when you're looking at stereotypes. And as we know, stereotypes can be extremely offensive. So writing about representations. So when discussing representations in media, we need to consider the following. So you'll know that we need to consider the selection. So what is being represented as what? How they are being represented as such. So you need to look at the portrayal in terms of technical and cultural codes. So how are technical and cultural codes in the film, for example, showing that somebody is represented as something? And the effect. What is the impact of the representation? What are the audience meant to feel? Make sure that you're referring to stereotypes and cultural assumptions in this bit. So, for example, if we go back to this woman here, our stereotypical housewife, here's an example. So with the selection, the character is represented as a stereotypical 1950s housewife. That's the selection, that is who is being represented as what. And the next part, so this is where we're dealing with the technical and cultural codes. So we're talking about costume here. She wears a brightly coloured apron which connotes the homemaker, cooking, baking and so on. She also wears rubber gloves and holds a cloth showing that she is also ready to clean. So again, some costumes and props in there. We see her in a kitchen, so the setting, the stereotypical domain of the housewife. The setting and her hairdo and clothing all seem quite retro with a definite 50s style, demonstrating further that this is not a modern day housewife. Finally, her makeup, jewellery and heels, plus her smiling expression and jaunty body language, makes her seem happy to be in this role and also physically attractive. This further ties into the 1950s housewife stereotype, as they were seen as uncomplaining and always had to appear appealing to their husbands and guests. So, what is the effect of that? This is the effect. This stereotype is one that existed in the past when the dominant ideology was that genders had clearly defined roles. Men worked, women kept house and strived to please their men. This stereotype is arguably outdated in our society nowadays, where the dominant ideology for gender roles is much more equal and women can hold down professional jobs, as well as marrying, having kids and keeping a nice house. This representation could therefore be offensive to modern day female audiences, as it reduces their role to a purely domestic one. So that's the effect of it, and you can see there that the answer incorporates stereotypes and dominant ideologies and the cultural assumptions that we make about this particular image. So, women in The Dark Knight, let's talk about them a little, just in sort of general terms to start off with. So here you can see some of the female characters that we meet in The Dark Knight. So women in general in The Dark Knight tend to be represented as being very sexualised, they are objectified and they are gold diggers. It might be a good idea for you to make some notes on how women are represented in general in The Dark Knight from this slide, because quite soon I'm going to ask you to do a task on one of the female characters, and I would like you to sort of draw upon this more general explanation of how women are represented in The Dark Knight in order to do that task. So first of all, they're sexualised, objectified and gold diggers. Rachel, for example, is a princess character type who is in need of rescuing by Batman. She's shown to be tempted by two men, and we know this because of the scene where she kisses Bruce Wayne, but she's in a relationship with Harvey. She's also in a position of power. So when she's shown to be interrogating Lau, however, her shirt is unbuttoned, and you can see that in this image here, so that it's revealing, and this is actually sexualising her. So although she's quite a powerful woman in her job, she's still Nolan's still sexualising her by having her in this sort of low cut unbuttoned shirt. Laura Mulvey's male gaze theory positions the audience to view women through the eyes of heterosexual men, which is why we see the low cut shirt unbuttoned, the shirt being unbuttoned on Rachel here. Now, Natasha is a prima ballerina and is also shown to be only interested in money, as her and the rest of the Russian ballet go on a love boat with billionaire Bruce Wayne, and women are represented as gold diggers through Natasha. And also we see the prostitute in the club with Maroni. I'm going to put this PowerPoint on on your Teams page. So if you want to go and have a wee look at that scene, then you can get the link from the PowerPoint that's going to be in the file section of Teams. So Rachel is the one that we're going to look at in more detail. So here she is here. Okay, so she's got a sort of jaunty stance, she's got her sort of power suit on there, but she's got it unbuttoned and it's very low cut. So here we can say that we're thinking about how Rachel herself is being represented in the film. We can say that she is represented on the one hand as a strong, independent business person. And we know that because of the costume that she wears. So she does wear suits, which are commonly used as a sort of masculine costume for men to show their power. And we also see it in her body language and facial expressions, and also the dialogue in her interrogation scene. And I'm going to show you that just now, guys. So just bear with me for a second and we'll watch that.
Look, give us the money and we'll talk about making a deal.
Money is the only reason I'm still alive.
Oh, you mean when they find out that you've helped us, they're gonna kill you?
Are you threatening my client?
No, I'm just assuming your client's cooperation with this investigation. As will everyone. No? Okay. Enjoy your time in county, Mr. Lau.
Wait. I won't give you the money, but I will give you my clients. All of them.
You were a glorified accountant. What could you possibly have on all of them that we could charge?
I'm good with calculation. I handled all their investments. One big pot.
Got it.
1 minute.
Rico. If they pooled their money, we can charge them all as one criminal conspiracy.
Charge them what?
In a Rico case, if you can charge one of the conspirators with a felony, you can charge
Charge
all.
all of them with it. That's great. Mr. Lau, what kind of details do you have about this communal fund? Ledgers, no.
Immunity, protection, and a chartered plane back to Hong Kong.
After you testify in open court. And I'm just curious, with all your clients locked up, what's going to happen with all that money?
Like I said, I'm good with calculation.
He can't go to county. I'll keep him here in the holding cell.
What is this, score in your fortress?
You trust them over county?
I don't trust them here.
Well, stays.
So, recapping.
Okay, so you can see there, if I just go back to the current slides here, so you can see there that that interrogation of Lau, as done by Rachel, you can see a lot of sort of very strong body language that shows her her confidence. The way that she moves around the room shows that she's sort of moving around it like she sort of owns it. She keeps constant eye contact with Lau to show that she is the one in charge. The camera angle is slightly beneath her as well, showing her to be a powerful character in this particular scene. But so all of that, it sort of gives the impression, all of that portrays Rachel as this strong, independent sort of assistant district attorney or business person or whatever you want to call her. However, in that same scene, we see her going out of the interrogation room to go and speak to Harvey. Now, the way that she is positioned in that shot when she's speaking to Harvey is extremely different to how she is portrayed when she's actually in the interrogation room. And that might be one of your other points. So what do you notice is the difference? Just as an example, what do you notice is the difference between how the Rachel is shot and portrayed in the room with Harvey in that scene against... in relation to how she is shot and portrayed when she's actually interrogating Lau. It's very, very different. So this is the task that I would like you to do. Pause the video here, and in a spider diagram, I want you to make notes of the selection and portrayals of Rachel. Remember, for the portrayal, you should focus on technical and cultural codes. So you need to be talking about camera angles, costume, facial expressions, and body language and all that sort of stuff. I am going to put up a Word document as well onto Teams that has a description of different scenes that Rachel is in. So you might want to have a look at that document to see what examples you could draw on to think about the selection and portrayals of Rachel. Also, see if you go onto, I'll just show you here, if you go onto YouTube and you type in Rachel Dawes The Dark Knight, like I've done here, it'll come up with loads of different video clips in The Dark Knight that has Rachel in them. Sometimes you'll see ones from Batman Begins, but ignore that, it should just be The Dark Knight that you're looking at. But you can have a look at these scenes with Rachel in them to help you with examples and representations for Rachel in The Dark Knight. Okay, so have a look at the Word document and have a look at YouTube as well for the different selections and portrayals. Okay, so pause the video here and get on with that task, please. I would like you to come up with another possibly 3 selections and portrayals of Rachel if you can. Okay, so now that you have now that you've done that, guys, what I would like you to do is to analyse the representation of Rachel in The Dark Knight. So this is your next task. So I want you to use the selection and the portrayals that you came up with in your spider diagram. And I want you to try and come up with explanations of 3 different representations. Now you can use the representation that the example that I gave you, which was that she's a strong, independent, professional woman or business person or whatever you want to call her. You can use that one, or you can use, and then 2 of your own, or you can just use 3 of your own. But make sure that you're looking at 3 different representations of Rachel. So I want you to explain it in this way. Using selection, so what is Rachel represented as? How is she represented as this thing? So use technical and cultural codes for your explanations. And then this third one, this is going to be your new explanation of these representations. So the effect, what is the impact of this representation? How are we as the audience meant to feel about Rachel at this point? And make sure that you refer to the stereotypes and cultural assumptions that we've already discussed about dominant ideologies to do with feminine beauty and dominant ideologies that focused on the roles of women. So I'm going to give you, take as much time as you need to do this, because I think this will be quite a lengthy answer that you'll need to give, guys. And if you need to, you can go back to that slide that had the 1950s housewife in it, that had the example selection, portrayal and effect written about her. So go back and have a look at that example before you write up your own 3 examples about the different representations of Rachel. So make sure that when you're doing that, try to bring in ideas of the stereotypical princess, or the fact that she's a damsel in distress, and how she fulfills that character role, or perhaps maybe how she fails to fulfill it. Maybe you don't see her as a stereotypical princess. Also, excuse me, bring in the dominant ideologies of femininity. So like I had said, consider her physical appearance in the film, and consider her role as a woman and as a professional in the film. Think about the relationships that she has with other characters in the film as well. Here's an example about Commissioner Gordon. So again, you can draw on the example paragraphs of the 1950s housewife, and you can also draw on the example paragraph that I'm going to show you here about Commissioner Gordon. So the selection of Commissioner Gordon shows that Commissioner Gordon is represented as a highly moral man. So that's the selection. He wants good to prevail over evil. This is sometimes even at the expense of the correct rules and social order. He isn't afraid to break the rules or put aside his own feelings if it is for the common good, showing that he is a sensible man. This is portrayed through the cultural codes. So now we're talking about selection, so technical and cultural codes here. Sorry, portrayal. So now we're talking about the cultural and technical codes here. So this is portrayed through the cultural codes of his moustache and his smart suit, as well as the frequent close-ups of his very kind face. It is also evident in his calm manner when meeting Harvey Dent and the fact that he is Batman's main contact. And finally, what's the effect of this? So Gordon's closing speech demonstrates his passion for the common good and his understanding of the sacrifice that it takes. Gordon is therefore a key player in Batman's success, meaning that he is a helper and donor character. He brings the vigilante side of Batman to the right side of the law. So make sure that you have another read over of this paragraph to do with Commissioner Gordon. Have another read over of the paragraph that talks about the 1950s housewife, and then I would like you to, I'll just go back, tackle this task on 3 representations explained about Rachel in The Dark Knight. You can either write these on paper, guys, or you can type them up into class notebook. Whatever you do, make sure that your final work goes into your class notebook so that myself or Mr. Tibbets or Mrs. Mackenzie can have a look and we can give you some feedback on it. Okay? Thanks, guys.